Imagine going to the emergency room with, like a broken arm.
Right. Something super obvious.
Exactly. You expect a certain level of precision, right? You get an x-ray, the doctor points to a jagged white line on the film and says, there it is, that's the problem. Here is the cast.
Binary.
Clean. Yeah, it's broken or it's not. But imagine if instead of fixing the bone, the doctor looks at the x-ray and prescribes you anti-piracy medication.
What?
Right. And then he just starts arguing with the hospital administration about who's paying the electric bill.
I mean, you would immediately assume the entire diagnostic machine is just completely broken.
Completely. You'd be looking at a landscape that is totally murky, contradictory, and just deeply confusing.
Yeah.
And that is the exact sensation you get when you step out of the hospital and into the world of modern international alliances.
Oh, for sure.
We are looking at a geopolitical x-ray right now, and the results are, frankly, mind-bending. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
If you are listening to this, you are that perpetually curious learner who doesn't just want the headlines. You want to know the actual mechanics of how the world works.
Right. The stuff beneath the surface.
Exactly. And today, we have a topic that is just overflowing with profound, almost unbelievable ironies.
It really is.
We are looking at a military alliance that was forged 76 years ago, for one hyper-specific reason, to stare down thousands of Soviet tanks idling across the Fulda Gap in Europe.
A very clear, very physical threat.
But today, that exact same alliance is trying to shoot down autonomous drone swarms. It has hunted pirates off the coast of Africa.
Yeah, the anti-piracy thing is always wild to think about.
It's crazy, and it is actively navigating internal political crises so severe they threaten to tear the whole thing apart.
It is the ultimate evolution, and frankly, to understand this specific organization is to possess, like, the ultimate shortcut to understanding how modern geopolitics actually functions.
You really can't grasp the news without it.
No, you cannot understand the world today without understanding this specific architecture.
So let's lay out our source material and our mission. We are drawing from a massively comprehensive, highly updated encyclopedic overview of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
And just to be clear, our source data is completely current as of March 2026.
Right. And our mission for you today is to trace this staggering evolution. We are going to unpack exactly how NATO transformed from a relatively dormant, quiet Cold War defense pact
into a sprawling, highly controversial global crisis manager.
Exactly. And then we are going to examine the completely unprecedented existential challenges it is facing right at this very moment in 2026.
And just to set the stage, we really need to quantify the sheer scale of the Leviathan we are discussing here.
The numbers are insane.
They are. The statistics from our 2026 source material are almost difficult for the human brain to process. We are talking about an alliance representing 32 distinct sovereign nations.
30.
Yeah. And it encompasses approximately 3.5 million active military and civilian personnel.
Wow.
But here is the number that truly dictates global power dynamics, right? The combined military spending of these 32 nations constitutes over half of the entire global total.
Half of the whole planet's military budget.
Yes. In 2025 alone, we are looking at an estimated combined budget of $1.588 trillion US dollars.
Over $1.5 trillion in a single year.
It's a pool of resources that it defies imagination.
So how do you even begin to build something like that? I mean, it doesn't just spring out of nowhere.
No, it took a very specific set of terrors to build it.
Right. I want to rewind the clock and look at the blueprint.
Right.
Let's start in the late 1940s, because Europe at this moment is, well, it's utterly devastated.
The continent is essentially a graveyard of empires.
The Second World War is over, cities are rubble, economies are bankrupt, and the geopolitical temperature is plunging. Where does the actual seed of NATO get planted?
Well, to find the very first seed, you actually have to look before the Second World War even ended.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The source traces the earliest conceptual origin back to the Atlantic Charter in 1941.
Okay, so U.S. and U.K.
Exactly. This was an agreement drafted by the United States and the United Kingdom, essentially laying out a philosophical framework for the post-war world.
Right, rejecting territorial expansion.
Yes, they wanted a system of international cooperation that explicitly rejected that old model of empire building. But, philosophical frameworks don't stop tanks.
Yeah, you need actual hardware for that.
Right. The real structural predecessors began to emerge in 1947, driven by a very specific, immediate fear.
And at that moment in 1947, the immediate fear wasn't actually the Soviet Union, right? Which, I mean, that feels so counterintuitive to everything we are taught about the Cold War.
It is totally counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But you have to put yourself in the shoes of, like, a French or British citizen in 1947.
They had just survived the worst war in human history.
Yeah. Exactly. Initiated by Germany. So in March 1947, France and the United Kingdom signed the Treaty of Dunkirk.
Dunkirk. Okay.
Fundamentally, this is a treaty of alliance and mutual assistance explicitly designed to counter the possibility of a resurgent, aggressive Germany.
They were terrified history is going to repeat itself for a third time.
Exactly.
So the very first brick in the wall is actually pointed at Germany, not Moscow. That is fascinating.
It is.
But, I mean, a two-nation treaty between two broke, war-torn countries isn't exactly a massive deterrent.
Precisely. They recognized their own weakness pretty quickly. So exactly 1 year later, in March 1948, they expanded that framework.
Who did they bring in?
They signed the Treaty of Brussels, which brought in the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Okay, so growing slightly.
Yeah. This created something called the Brussels Treaty Organization, which was commonly known as the Western Union. So now you have a bloc of 5 Western European nations pledging mutual defense.
But I'm looking at this map in my head, and I'm genuinely confused by how we get from a small cluster of Western European countries to a massive transatlantic behemoth.
It requires a big leap across the ocean.
Right, because historically, the United States absolutely hates peacetime European military entanglements. George Washington literally used his farewell address to warn America to stay out of European alliances.
The ultimate isolationist warning.
Yeah. What on earth happened in the late 40s to make Washington do a complete 180-degree turn and sign on to protect Europe?
What happened was the realization that a much larger, much more organized shadow was falling across the continent.
The Soviet Union.
Exactly. While the Western Union was worrying about a hypothetical resurgent Germany, the United States was watching the Soviet Union actively consolidating power across Eastern Europe.
They were just absorbing territory.
Right, and the pivotal shift in American thinking was the Truman Doctrine, formulated in 1947. President Harry Truman essentially argued that the U.S. could no longer, retreat behind the Atlantic Ocean.
The ocean wasn't big enough anymore.
No, the doctrine promoted international solidarity against what Washington perceived as aggressive expansionist communism. They realized that if Europe fell into economic collapse, communist ideologies would become incredibly appealing to starving populations.
So it starts as economic and political containment. But then something happens that violently escalates the timeline. The source points to February 1948.
Yes, the February 1948 coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. This was the massive wake-up call.
What happened exactly?
Well, Czechoslovakia had been trying to maintain a bridge between East and West, but the Soviet-backed Communist Party staged a coup and seized absolute control of the government.
Let's really unpack the psychology of that moment. You're sitting in Washington or London or Paris. You just spent years fighting a world war to liberate Europe from totalitarianism.
Right.
And suddenly you watch a functioning sovereign democracy get completely swallowed whole by a Soviet-backed authoritarian regime.
And without a single shot being fired by an invading army.
Right. It was an internal subversion backed by the threat of the Red Army. That had to be utterly terrifying.
It proved that diplomatic containment was failing completely.
So what's the immediate reaction?
It fundamentally shifted the calculus. It proved that economic aid like the Marshall Plan just wasn't going to be enough.
They needed something harder.
Europe needed a physical security umbrella so it could have the breathing room to rebuild its economies. The fear was palpable. I mean, if Czechoslovakia could fall that easily, what was stopping the same thing from happening in Italy or France?
Because domestic communist parties were already gaining immense traction there.
Exactly. So, secretly, transatlantic military talks began in Washington that very same month, March 1948.
And those transatlantic talks are what finally shatter the American tradition of isolationism. The United States realizes it has to anchor itself to Europe.
Which culminates in April 1949.
April 4th, 1949. The signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C.
You have the 5 member states of the Western Union joining forces with the United States, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland.
12 founding members in total. Now, I want to highlight a detail from our source here that breaks the usual stereotype.
Oh, about the drafting.
Yeah. We often think of these massive treaties as just being dictated by American military muscle. But the source notes that a Canadian diplomat, Lester B. Pearson, was actually a key author and primary drafter of this foundational treaty.
It was a genuine transatlantic collaboration.
And Lester B. Pearson's drafting was crucial because he helped forge the core mechanism of the entire treaty.
The beating heart of NATO.
Right. The clause that changes the world, which is Article 5.
Article 5. If you only remember one thing about NATO, it has to be this.
Walk us through exactly what this mechanism is and why it was so revolutionary.
Article 5 is the ultimate expression of collective security. It legally enshrines the principle that an armed attack against one member state in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
It is the Musketeer Pledge.
Exactly. All for one and one for all. If Soviet tanks roll into a tiny border town in Norway, it is treated under international law as if those tanks just rolled into Washington, D.C. or London or Paris.
And that is a massive psychological deterrent. You aren't just invading a small country. You are instantly at war with the entire Western Hemisphere.
The stakes become apocalyptic.
But here's a dynamic that I find so incredibly telling about human nature and massive bureaucracies. They sign this monumental treaty in 1949. They take the photos, they shake hands, they make the speeches, and then virtually nothing happens on the ground.
Yeah, it's wild.
The source literally describes the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as being largely dormant initially. It was a promise on a piece of paper.
The piece of paper doesn't stop an army.
Right. Yeah. It took an entirely different crisis on the complete opposite side of the planet to force them to actually build the physical machinery of an alliance.
That is a phenomenal point that is often lost in the history books. A treaty is just words until you give it teeth.
So what provided the teeth?
The event that provided the teeth was the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950.
Wait, a war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, thousands of miles away from the North Atlantic. Why does that trigger a panic in Western Europe?
Because of the perceived precedent. In 1950, the Communist forces of North Korea violently surged across the 38th parallel to invade South Korea.
And Europe watched this happen.
To the leaders sitting in Western Europe, the analogy was direct and terrifying. They looked at the map and thought, if the communist bloc is willing to unilaterally cross a recognized border in Asia with military force, what is stopping the Soviet Red Army from surging across the border into West Germany tomorrow?
The Korean War proved that the Cold War wasn't just going to be political tension.
Right, it could erupt into conventional hot warfare at a moment's notice.
The theoretical threat suddenly became highly literal.
Exactly. And the NATO members realized that having a piece of paper signed in Washington wasn't going to stop a tank column.
No.
If war broke out in Europe, they couldn't spend 3 weeks trying to figure out which general was in charge.
Or realize that the British artillery shells didn't fit into the French cannons.
Or that their communication radios operated on different frequencies.
Yeah.
They needed a unified, integrated military command structure standing by at all times.
So what did they build?
In 1951, they formed Shaped the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to make this shift crystal clear. Imagine you and your neighbors are getting nervous about crime.
Sure.
So you form a neighborhood watch, you sign a charter on a piece of paper that says, hey, if anyone breaks into house number 4, we all agree to run out into the street with our flashlights and baseball bats.
Okay, a nice community promise.
That piece of paper is the 1949 NATO treaty. It's a nice promise, but it relies on everyone waking up and grabbing their gear in time.
Right. It's reactive and, frankly, disorganized.
Exactly. But then you turn on the morning news and see that a neighborhood across town just got violently invaded by an organized gang.
That news report is the Korean War.
Yes. Suddenly you look at your neighbors and realize flashlights and baseball bats aren't going to cut it. We are not prepared.
You need an upgrade.
A massive upgrade. So you don't just update the charter. You all pool your money, you buy a vacant lot on the corner of the street, you build a massive, fully fortified police precinct.
With professional gear.
You stock it with weapons, you install a massive radio tower, and you hire a full-time professional chief of police to sit at the desk 24/7, ready to dispatch cars the second a window breaks.
That is a brilliant way to understand it. SHAPE is the police precinct.
And who is the first chief of police?
The very first Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, was none other than U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Wow, bringing in the heavy hitter.
His appointment brought immense credibility. Under SHAPE, NATO began the grueling, highly technical work of interoperability.
Which means what, practically?
They standardized military equipment, they established protocols for different languages, and they created formal agreements allowing foreign troops, specifically hundreds of thousands of American troops, to be permanently stationed on sovereign European soil during peacetime.
That had never been done before.
Never. The institutionalization just accelerates at breakneck speed. They established the post of Secretary General in 1952 to handle the civilian and political side.
Greece and Turkey joined the alliance that same year, right? Expanding the flank into the Mediterranean.
Correct. But the true tectonic shift, the moment the Cold War cement really dries in Europe, happens in May 1955.
Yes, the integration of West Germany.
Following intense diplomatic conferences in London and Paris, the occupying powers agreed to end their occupation. West Germany was permitted to rebuild its military and was officially brought into NATO.
Now, we talked about the 1947 Treaty of Dunkirk being entirely about the fear of a rearmed Germany. Just 8 years later, France and Britain are agreeing to let Germany rearm and are welcoming them into their own military alliance.
It's a stunning reversal.
That requires a massive swallowing of pride and historical trauma.
It was incredibly controversial. But the strategic reality overrode the historical trauma.
It's the geography.
Exactly. NATO military planners looked at the map and realized that it was geographically impossible to defend Western Europe from a Soviet invasion without using West German territory.
And without German manpower.
They needed West Germany as the physical shield.
And how did Moscow react to their former mortal enemy being rearmed and absorbed into an American-led military bloc?
They reacted immediately and aggressively. The inclusion of West Germany into NATO was the direct primary catalyst for the Soviet Union creating its own rival alliance.
The Warsaw Pact.
Yes. Later that exact same year, 1955, they signed the Warsaw Pact.
So now the board is completely set. The pieces are locked in place. You have NATO in the west, the Warsaw Pact in the east, and right down the middle of Europe runs the Iron Curtain, literally manifesting as the Berlin Wall in 1961.
The standoff is locked in.
The source identifies this period as the absolute height of Cold War tensions. You have over 400,000 U.S. troops permanently stationed in Europe.
The tension was unbelievably high.
We are talking about nuclear bombers on 24-hour alert, massive tank battalions staring at each other across the border.
Waiting for the balloon to go up.
But, and this is a fact from the text that just stops you dead in your tracks when you really think about it. During this entire period, from 1949 all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, NATO never conducted a single military operation.
Not one. For 40 years, the Integrated Military Command never fired a shot in anger.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because if I'm a taxpayer looking at this, I'm asking a very basic question.
Let's hear it.
You're spending trillions of dollars building massive headquarters, standardizing millions of bullets, keeping hundreds of thousands of troops on high alert for 4 decades. If they never fired a shot, wasn't this entire alliance just a giant, colossally expensive paperweight?
Did it fail to actually do anything?
Right.
That is exactly the question people ask when they misunderstand the fundamental paradoxical nature of deterrence.
Explain the paradox.
The entire purpose of deterrence is to be a paperweight. The tension is the point. A defensive alliance like NATO during the Cold War wasn't built to fight and win a war. It was built to make the prospect of starting a war so unimaginably apocalyptic that the enemy never even tries.
So it's a massive, highly armed waiting game.
Exactly. It's the psychology of the nuclear umbrella. If the Soviet Union believed they could invade West Germany and only fight the West Germans, they might have tried it.
But because of Article 5.
Because of Article 5, they knew that crossing that border meant an immediate, devastating response from the United States, likely escalating to global nuclear annihilation.
It's a tripwire.
The fact that NATO never fired a shot isn't evidence of it being a useless paperweight. Strategically speaking, 40 years of absolute silence is the ultimate, undeniable proof of its success.
It did exactly what it was designed to do. It froze the conflict.
A perfectly forged, infinitely heavy shield never has to be raised in anger because nobody is crazy enough to swing a sword at it.
I totally get the logic now. But here's the problem with building the perfect shield. Eventually, the guy holding the sword gets tired or goes bankrupt and just goes home.
And that brings us to 1989.
The great geopolitical earthquake of the late 20th century. In 1989, the physical manifestation of this standoff, the Berlin Wall, is torn down by civilians.
The revolutions of 1989 sweep across Eastern Europe, overthrowing communist regimes.
East Germany reunifies with West Germany and is absorbed into NATO in 1990. In February 1991, the rival gang, the Warsaw Pact, officially dissolves itself.
And then the absolute unthinkable happens.
December 1991, the Soviet Union, the primary existential threat that birthed NATO, completely dissolves.
The enemy ceases to exist, which thrusts the alliance into the most profound existential crisis of its history.
And logically, this is where the story should end, right?
You think so?
Going back to our analogy, if you build a massive, hyper-expensive police precinct purely to counter one specific terrifying local gang, and then that gang completely disbands and crime drops to zero, you don't keep paying for the precinct.
You board up the windows and lay off the cops.
You enjoy the peace, but NATO didn't pack up and go home. Why not? How do they justify their existence in the 1990s?
That is the defining question of the era. The 1990s required a total ground-up strategic reevaluation of NATO's purpose.
Did they downsize at all?
Initially, yes. There was a massive physical drawdown. They tried to cash in on what was called the peace dividend.
Yeah.
In November 1990, NATO and the Soviet Union signed the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe,
The CFE Treaty.
commonly known as the CFE Treaty, in Paris. This wasn't just a political handshake. It was a mandate for specific, massive military reductions across the continent.
The numbers in the source material regarding this treaty are staggering.
They really are.
The CFE Treaty allowed signatories to physically remove or destroy 52,000 pieces of conventional armaments over the next 16 years.
52,000.
How do you even do that? We are talking about literally cutting up tens of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and attack helicopters with blowtorches while inspectors from the opposing side watch to verify it.
It's an incredible logistical feat of disarmament.
And the financial impact was huge. Military spending by NATO's European members plummeted by 28% between 1990 and 2015.
They were dismantling the Cold War machine piece by piece. But geopolitics, much like nature, absolutely abhors a vacuum.
Oh, definitely.
The tragedy of the 1990s was that as the rigid, frozen pressure of the Cold War melted away, ancient, long-suppressed ethnic and national tensions began to violently boil to the surface.
Particularly in the Balkans.
Because without the Soviet Union and the United States constantly enforcing order in their respective spheres, the local pressure cookers exploded.
And this forced NATO into a deeply uncomfortable position.
Very uncomfortable. They had to decide if they were going to extend their activities into political and humanitarian crises that had never, strictly speaking, been NATO's legal concern.
The defining catalyst for this pivot was the brutal, bloody breakup of Yugoslavia.
Right.
Okay, so after 40 years of sitting quietly in their barracks, Yugoslavia is where the alliance finally unsheaths the sword. Walk us through how they get pulled into this.
The Bosnian War begins in 1992. The situation on the ground deteriorates incredibly rapidly into horrific sectarian violence and ethnic cleansing.
And the UN steps in first, right?
The international community is paralyzed, but eventually, the United Nations Security Council authorizes a strict no-fly zone over central Bosnia and Herzegovina to stop the aerial bombardment of civilians.
But the UN doesn't have an air force.
Exactly. They need someone to enforce it. So NATO steps up. In April 1993, they launch Operation Deny Flight to enforce the UN mandate.
And then comes the historical milestone.
Yes. February 28, 1994. 4 Bosnian Serb fighter jets violate the no-fly zone. NATO aircraft intercept them and shoot them down.
Wow.
This is the first wartime combat action NATO has taken in its entire history.
The first shot's fired. It's a massive psychological Rubicon to cross. You are no longer just a deterrent. You are an active combatant.
And the escalation continued. In August 1995, following the horrifying, internationally condemned Srebrenica genocide, NATO realizes that passive enforcement isn't enough.
So what do?
They launch Operation Deliberate Force. This was a massive, 2-week coordinated bombing campaign targeting the military capabilities of the Army of the Republika Srpska.
Did it work?
Strategically, it worked. The airstrikes were highly instrumental in forcing the warring parties to the negotiating table, resulting in the Dayton Agreement in November 1995, which ended the Bosnian War.
And they put boots on the ground after that.
NATO followed up by deploying tens of thousands of peacekeeping troops to enforce the treaty.
So within a few years, we have transitioned from a static, heavily armored shield waiting for the Soviets into an active, highly mobile peacemaking force trying to stop genocides in the Balkans.
It's a completely new identity.
But the real controversy, the moment that truly tested the legal and moral boundaries of this new identity, happens a few years later. We have to talk about Kosovo.
Kosovo is a crucial case study because it raises incredibly difficult questions about international law versus moral legitimacy.
Set the scene for us.
In 1998, Slobodan Milosevic launched a brutal, systematic crackdown against ethnic Albanian separatists and civilians in the province of Kosovo. It was turning into a massive humanitarian catastrophe.
Another ethnic cleansing scenario.
Yes, the United Nations demanded an immediate ceasefire, but negotiations completely collapsed. NATO, acting on the argument that a massive refugee crisis and genocide on their borders was a direct threat to European security, decided to intervene.
What was the operation?
In March 1999, they launched Operation Allied Force, a 78-day sustained bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
Okay, hold on. Let me jump in here because there is a massive legal catch to this operation, isn't there?
There is.
I'm looking at the timeline, and my understanding is they launched this massive bombing campaign on a sovereign nation without explicit authorization from the UN Security Council. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. They acted without a UN mandate, and it generated immense, furious international criticism.
Well, yeah. Let's follow the logic here. If NATO, which was designed purely as a defensive shield to protect its own borders, suddenly acts without UN approval to bomb a country that hasn't attacked a NATO member, doesn't that fundamentally change the DNA of the alliance?
It's a valid question.
Doesn't it transform NATO from a defensive neighborhood watch into an offensive geopolitical enforcer that just acts whenever it feels like it?
That is exactly the criticism leveled by several nations, notably Russia and China at the time. They argued it was an illegal war of aggression.
And what was NATO's defense?
The counter-argument from the US, the UK, and the NATO leadership was deeply pragmatic and morally driven. They pointed out a flaw in the UN system. They knew that if they went to the Security Council for a vote to authorize force, Russia and China would have immediately exercised their veto power to block it.
Because they were historic allies of Serbia or opposed Western intervention on principle.
Right. So the US and UK argued, are we going to sit back and watch a genocide happen in our own backyard just because of a procedural veto at the UN?
They chose morality over procedure.
They argued that allowing a humanitarian catastrophe to unfold unchecked would completely undermine the moral authority of the alliance and nullify its entire purpose in a post-Cold War world.
You can't claim to be the guarantor of European security while Europe burns next door.
So they bombed. And they formally recognized this new reality. At their 1999 Washington summit, NATO officially adopted a new alliance strategic concept.
Rewriting the doctrine?
They explicitly wrote into their own doctrine that conflict prevention and crisis management acting outside their borders to stop instability were now core tasks right alongside territorial defense.
They didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote the rulebook to match their new behavior.
Exactly.
And right alongside this massive pivot to crisis management, you have another monumental shift happening in the late 90s. The borders of the alliance start moving, the eastward expansion.
This is arguably the most consequential, heavily debated, and historically resonant policy of the entire era.
Why did they start expanding?
Politically, NATO wanted to stabilize the newly autonomous Central and Eastern European states that had just broken free from the Soviet bloc. Initially, they created diplomatic halfway houses, like the Partnership for Peace in 1994.
Just to build trust.
Right, to build trust and military cooperation without full membership. But the Eastern European nations wanted the real thing.
They wanted Article 5.
And at that same pivotal 1999 Washington summit, they made it official. Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic formally joined the alliance. NATO also established membership action plans to give other nations a clear checklist of democratic and military reforms needed to join in the future.
Now, I want to pause here. We are looking at a policy expanding NATO eastward toward the Russian border. That is the absolute white-hot core of so much modern geopolitical conflict today.
It is the root of the current friction.
To truly understand this, we have to look at the historical collision of two completely incompatible perspectives. And we're going to look at this impartially, strictly through the lens of the historical source material, because understanding both sides is the only way to make sense of the modern world.
Absolutely.
Let's start with Warsaw. Why did Eastern Europe want in so desperately?
For the Central and Eastern European states, joining NATO was a matter of sheer, desperate historical survival. A 2006 study highlighted in our source points out that NATO enlargement significantly contributed to the rapid democratic consolidation of these countries.
But the main driver was fear, wasn't it?
The driving emotion was absolute fear. Take Poland, for example. Historically, Poland has been invaded, partitioned, erased from the map, and subjugated by its neighbors, primarily Russia and Germany, repeatedly over the centuries.
They have a tragic geographic position.
For them, joining NATO wasn't a provocation. It was the ultimate necessary security guarantee. They were voluntarily rushing under the American nuclear umbrella.
And the public supported this.
Overwhelmingly. In fact, the source notes a later survey showing that 65% of the Polish public viewed Russia as a major threat, and they overwhelmingly viewed NATO as a purely protective, life-saving alliance.
So from the perspective of Warsaw, Prague, or Budapest, this is a triumphant story of newly free democracies exercising their sovereign right to choose their own allies and finally secure their borders after decades of terror.
That's their reality.
Okay, now flip the map. Let's look at this from Moscow's perspective in the 1990s. How did Russia view this expansion?
From the very beginning, Russian leaders viewed eastward enlargement not as the spread of democracy, but as a direct, aggressive threat to their core national security interests.
They felt surrounded.
And, crucially, they viewed it as a profound betrayal.
A betrayal of what? Was there a treaty?
No formal treaty, and that's the crux of the issue. The source references declassified memoranda of private, high-level diplomatic conversations from 1990. During the delicate negotiations over allowing a reunified Germany to join NATO, several Western leaders, most notably U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, gave verbal assurances to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
What was the phrase?
The famous phrase was that NATO jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch eastward.
Not 1 inch.
Now, the West argues those assurances only applied to East Germany at that specific time, not the rest of Eastern Europe.
But Russia didn't see it that way.
The deeply entrenched Russian perspective is that the West made an informal promise to not exploit the collapse of the Soviet Union by encroaching on Russia's borders, and then the West immediately broke that promise by absorbing former Warsaw Pact states.
It is a recipe for catastrophic friction. You have sovereign, independent nations exercising their undeniable legal right to join a defensive alliance for their own psychological and physical security.
Right.
And on the other side, you have a former humiliated superpower feeling increasingly encircled, claiming a broken promise, and watching a massive military apparatus slowly crawl toward its borders. It's two trains on the same track.
It is the defining geopolitical tragedy of the post-Cold War era. But as the 1990s came to a close, NATO felt triumphant.
They felt they were winning.
They had proven they could operate as a crisis manager in the Balkans. They were successfully expanding their democratic footprint eastward, and they felt confident in their new identity.
But the true test of this new out-of-area crisis management capability was about to be triggered, and it wasn't going to be triggered in Europe.
No, it wasn't.
It brings us to an event that nobody in Brussels or Washington foresaw. This is the era from 2001 to 2014, where NATO truly becomes a global operator. The catalyst, of course, is the morning of September 11th, 2001.
The September 11 attacks on the United States fundamentally, radically altered the trajectory and the operational reality of the alliance.
It changed everything.
We talked earlier about Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. For the entire 52-year history of the Cold War, every single military planner assumed that if Article 5 was ever invoked, it would be initiated by a European nation.
Right. The nightmare scenario was always Soviet tanks crossing into West Germany, prompting Europe to hit the alarm bell to draw American military might across the Atlantic to save them.
Exactly. The whole point was America acting as the big brother protecting the vulnerable European nations.
But history loves irony.
It really does. What actually happened was the complete total inverse. The first and only time Article 5 has ever been invoked in the history of NATO was on October 4th, 2001.
And it was invoked by the United States.
Yes, and it was invoked following a devastating attack by a non-state terrorist actor.
Think about the profound, staggering irony of that moment. A treaty, painstakingly engineered by American diplomats in 1949, designed to protect shivering European nations from the mighty Russian bear,
Is ultimately invoked over half a century later to legally oblige those European nations to protect the United States from terrorists operating out of caves in Central Asia.
It completely flips the script of the alliance.
It was a striking historical inversion, but to the alliance's credit, they responded with immediate solidarity. The European allies didn't hesitate. They invoked Article 5.
And this led to a massive operational shift.
By April 2003, NATO formally agreed to take command of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, in Afghanistan.
And when did they actually take over?
When the official handover of command happened in August 2003, it marked a monumental milestone. It was the first time in NATO's entire history that it took charge of a military mission completely outside the North Atlantic geographic area.
Okay, let's stop and really look at the logistics of this because it boggles the mind. We are talking about taking European militaries, say a German Panzer division or a British mechanized infantry unit, that have spent 40 years training exclusively to fight massive conventional tank battles on the flat, frozen plains of Eastern Europe with heavy armor. And suddenly, you are airlifting them thousands of miles away, dropping them into the high-altitude, rugged mountains of the Hindu Kush, and telling them to fight a decentralized counterinsurgency against the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
It's a completely different kind of war.
The sheer logistical, psychological, and doctrinal friction of that shift is insane.
The operational demands were absolutely staggering. You aren't just fighting an enemy, you were fighting the terrain, the culture, and your own internal bureaucracy.
How many countries were involved in ISAF?
At its peak, the ISAF mission included troops from 42 different countries. Imagine trying to coordinate a combat patrol, where the air support speaks a different language than the ground troops, and every single nation has a different set of political rules of engagement dictated by their home parliaments.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
Some nations' troops were allowed to engage in offensive combat, while others were strictly limited to guarding bases or rebuilding schools. It was a masterpiece of logistical improvisation, but it was incredibly inefficient and grueling.
And Afghanistan wasn't an isolated incident. Once NATO opened the door to being a global crisis manager, their resume expanded rapidly across the globe.
They took on a sweeping array of missions. In 2004, they formed the NATO training mission in Iraq to help assist and rebuild Iraqi security forces.
So they're in the desert now, too.
But the most surprising expansion was into the maritime domain. In 2009, in direct response to the United Nations World Food Programme's aid ships being hijacked, NATO launched Operation Ocean Shield.
Which did what?
They literally deployed advanced warships to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean to hunt down and combat Somali pirates.
Why is a North Atlantic military alliance fighting pirates off the Horn of Africa?
Because in a globalized economy, security isn't just about protecting your land borders. It's about protecting the economic lifelines of your member states.
The supply chain.
If global shipping choke points are shut down by pirates, European economies suffer. So they adapted.
So you have this dizzying reality where NATO forces are fighting mountain insurgents in landlocked Asian valleys, training police in the deserts of Iraq, and policing vital shipping lanes off the coast of Africa.
The scope is just massive.
But trying to be the world's policeman with a committee of 28 nations is bound to cause immense internal friction. And our source points to a specific breaking point in this era, the 2011 intervention in Libya.
Libya is a fascinating case study because it exposed the deep structural and political rot regarding burden sharing within the alliance.
What sparked the intervention?
In 2011, amid the chaos of the Arab Spring and the Libyan civil war, the UN Security Council actually authorized military action to protect Libyan civilians from Muammar Gaddafi's government forces.
So they had the mandate this time.
NATO stepped up, took control of enforcing the no-fly zone, and launched Operation Unified Protector.
A noble cause on paper, but behind closed doors, things were falling apart.
Falling apart rapidly. The veneer of a unified alliance was shattered. Reports surfaced that out of the 28 member states at the time, only 8 were actually participating in the combat strike operations.
Wait, only 8 out of 28?
Yes. The vast majority of the alliance either couldn't or wouldn't drop bombs. This resulted in a very public, highly embarrassing confrontation. U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates was furious.
What did she say?
He heavily and publicly criticized European allies, specifically calling out countries like Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, Turkey, and Germany. Gates demanded they contribute more to the actual fighting.
And how did they respond?
Well, some of those nations pushed back, arguing that NATO was overstepping its mandate and creeping into regime change.
And it wasn't just a lack of political will, right? It was a lack of actual physical capability.
Yes.
The source highlights this incredible, almost pathetic detail. During the Libya campaign, Danish fighter jets actually started running out of precision-guided bombs.
It's unbelievable.
And the British Royal Navy publicly stated that their current tempo of operations wasn't sustainable because of recent budget cuts. You have advanced European militaries literally running out of ammunition a few weeks into a limited air campaign right across the Mediterranean Sea.
It exposed the consequence of that peace dividend we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
When you slash defense budgets by 28% over 2 decades, you lose your operational depth.
You can't sustain a fight.
In a blistering farewell speech in Brussels, Robert Gates bluntly warned that these actions, The lack of military investment and the reliance on America to do the heavy lifting could ultimately cause the demise of NATO.
He didn't mince words.
He warned of a dim, if not dismal, future for the alliance. It highlighted a dangerous reality. The political will to act as a global crisis manager was severely fragmented.
And that fragmentation, the deep fatigue of these endless global missions, culminated in the most tragic way possible years later in Afghanistan.
It was a dark end to that chapter.
Our source notes that in August 2021, after NATO troops finally completed their withdrawal, the Afghan armed forces completely collapsed. The Taliban swept across the country and retook Kabul at lightning speed.
It was a devastating, chaotic exit.
Politicians within NATO member states openly described the withdrawal as the greatest debacle NATO had suffered since its founding in 1949.
It was a deeply traumatic, humbling end to a massive 2-decade-long project. It forced a harsh, painful reckoning within the halls of NATO about the absolute limits of military intervention, counterinsurgency, and the hubris of armed nation building.
But the irony of history is that NATO didn't even have time to mourn the failure in Afghanistan.
No, they were hit with something else immediately.
Because while they were bogged down in the Middle East and Africa for 20 years, fighting terrorism and hunting pirates and arguing with each other about who was paying for the bombs, a very traditional, highly conventional, state-on-state threat was quietly rebuilding its strength right back in their original backyard.
In Russia.
And this threat violently yanked the entire alliance by the collar, dragging it screaming back to its 1949 roots. This brings us to the era of 2014 to 2023. The pendulum swings back.
The massive wake-up call, the event that shattered the illusion of a post-Cold War peace in Europe, occurred in 2014. Russia, utilizing unmarked troops, rapidly annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine.
It was a blatant, forceful redrawing of European borders
Right.
by military might, something that wasn't supposed to happen anymore.
Exactly. It completely shocked the system. It led to immediate, strong condemnation by all NATO members. More importantly, it forced a rapid, screeching strategic pivot away from global crisis management and right back to the original mandate, territorial defense of the European continent.
And it finally hit them where it hurts.
The wallet.
At the 2014 NATO summit in Wales, they were forced to confront that exact burden-sharing issue that Robert Gates had been yelling about 3 years earlier.
Yes, the Wales summit was a monumental turning point. For years, there had been an informal guideline that member nations should spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. But almost nobody did it.
They just ignored it.
At Wales, shocked by the annexation of Crimea, the leaders of NATO's member states formally, publicly committed to hitting that 2% GDP defense spending target by the year 2024.
I love this detail because it is so relatable to everyday life. It is exactly like a giant group dinner at a restaurant.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
For years, maybe 2 or 3 people, mostly the United States, maybe the UK, have been quietly picking up the massive thousands of dollars tab, while everyone else chips in $5, eats the steak, and says thanks for dinner.
Exactly.
But suddenly, the restaurant manager comes over, locks the front doors, points at a threat outside, and demands that everyone open their wallets and prove they are paying their fair share.
And what's amazing is the threat of Russia was so real and the pressure was so intense that it actually worked.
Really? They actually paid up.
Our source updates us with data from mid-2024 showing that a record 23 out of the 32 member nations finally hit that 2% mark. In just 1 year, European and Canadian defense spending jumped an unprecedented 18%.
They finally started paying the bill.
Because the threat had escalated from a wake-up call to a full-blown catastrophe.
The invasion.
The ultimate catalyst for that massive, historic spike in spending was, of course, the events of February 2022. The full-scale, multi-axis Russian invasion of Ukraine. This event triggered an unprecedented reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank.
When you read the source material detailing the operational shifts that happened almost overnight in 2022, it is breathtaking.
It was a total paradigm shift back to Cold War footing. For the first time in the entire history of the alliance, elements of the NATO response force were officially activated for a deterrence mission.
And they moved troops immediately.
Multinational battle groups that had been slowly set up in the Baltic states and Poland were rapidly, massively expanded. By June 2022, NATO had deployed 40,000 highly trained combat troops along its 2,500-kilometer-long eastern flank.
40,000 troops right on the border.
They were digging in to deter any further Russian aggression from spilling over the border.
And the commitments became intensely concrete and long-term. The source notes that by 2025, Germany took a historic step.
Yes, they permanently stationed a full, heavy armored brigade in Lithuania.
I mean, just pause and think about the historical weight of that. Germany deploying heavy armor eastward to permanently guard the border against Russia.
It is a massive return to Cold War-style forward deployment, but this time the line isn't in divided Germany, it's on the borders of the former Soviet Union.
Furthermore, the 2022 invasion fundamentally, permanently altered the geopolitical map of Scandinavia.
That was huge.
Finland and Sweden are two nations that had maintained a strict, deeply ingrained status of military neutrality for decades. They stayed neutral through the entirety of the Cold War.
But watching the invasion of Ukraine caused a massive psychological shift.
They realized neutrality wasn't enough.
They abandoned that centuries-old neutrality to seek the safety of the Article 5 umbrella. They officially joined the alliance in 2023 and 2024, adding highly capable militaries and completely transforming the Baltic Sea into what some analysts call a NATO lake.
Which brings us right back to the white-hot core of this conflict. We touched on it in the 1990s, but it explodes in this era, the debate over NATO expansion.
This is the critical piece.
Once again, we have to look at this impartially, exactly as the historical source lays out the collision of doctrines, because this specific disagreement is what set Europe on fire.
Right. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, you have two diametrically opposed, entirely incompatible geopolitical doctrines clashing head-on.
On the NATO side, you have the open door policy.
The alliance maintains that any sovereign European nation that meets the democratic and military criteria has the right to apply for membership. In 2008, NATO had explicitly promised Georgia and Ukraine that they would eventually become members.
And Ukraine pushed for it.
After the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Ukraine voted to end its non-aligned status. And by 2019, the aspiration to join NATO was literally enshrined into the Ukrainian constitution.
So NATO's perspective is entirely legally based. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and it has the absolute right to self-determination and to choose its own security alliances without asking permission from its neighbors.
Okay, but how did Vladimir Putin interpret that open-door policy?
Well, the source details that Putin viewed the open door policy, particularly regarding Ukraine, not as a legal right, but as an existential, unacceptable military threat to the Russian state.
He drew a line in the sand.
In late 2021, amidst a massive buildup of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders, Putin drew absolute non-negotiable red lines. He warned that Ukraine joining NATO or the deployment of Western missile defense systems on Ukrainian soil was a direct threat to Russia's survival.
He even drafted a treaty, right?
Yes, the Russian Foreign Ministry went so far as to draft a proposed treaty publicly demanding that NATO formally forbid Ukraine or any other former Soviet state from ever joining the alliance.
And that wasn't all.
No. Furthermore, they demanded that NATO physically roll back its military forces and infrastructure from Eastern Europe entirely, returning to the borders of 1997.
They essentially demanded a time machine to undo 30 years of NATO expansion. And Brussels obviously said no.
Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg flatly, categorically rejected the demands. He stated that Russia has no veto power over who joins the alliance and absolutely no right to establish a 19th-century-style sphere of influence to control the foreign policy of its sovereign neighbors.
It is a profound, immovable clash of worldviews.
So let's look at the big picture here. What does this all mean for the concept of deterrence? This brings up the ultimate historical debate of our era, the question that historians, diplomats, and military strategists are going to be arguing about for the next century.
The chicken and egg question.
Exactly. Did NATO's relentless eastward expansion cause this devastating war by aggressively backing a paranoid, historically traumatized Russia into a geopolitical corner?
Or, conversely, was the brutal invasion of Ukraine the ultimate, undeniable proof that NATO expansion was absolutely necessary, because it showed exactly what Russia will do to a vulnerable neighbor that doesn't have the protection of Article 5?
That is the defining question of modern international relations. The source presents both the Russian argument of feeling strategically suffocated and the Eastern European reality of viewing an aggressive Russia as a major threat requiring an ironclad NATO shield.
The profound tragedy is that the complete failure to reconcile those two incompatible perspectives resulted in the catastrophic devastation of Ukraine.
But if you look strictly at the result for NATO itself, the outcome is undeniable. By the mid-2020s, the alliance had fully returned to its core original mandate.
It was larger, it was significantly better funded, its militaries were modernizing rapidly, and it was more unified against a clear external threat than it had been since the absolute height of the Cold War.
But, and this is a massive, terrifying, That renewed unity was incredibly fragile.
Because of internal politics.
Because while the military front looking east appeared fortified and locked down, the most severe existential threat to the survival of the alliance was suddenly coming from within its own house.
Which brings us to our final era, the one we are living through right now.
The era of 2024 to 2026, the modern fracture and the drone skies. Let's start with the military reality on the ground. By 2025, the nature of the external threat had evolved wildly from Cold War tank battalions.
Yes, warfare had shifted rapidly into new, highly technological, asymmetric domains. In September 2025, NATO was forced to launch Operation Eastern Sentry.
Now, this wasn't about massing armor on the border. This was about controlling the sky.
Precisely. Operation Eastern Sentry was a complex military initiative launched in direct response to repeated incursions of Russian drones into Polish and Romanian airspace.
Drones are changing everything.
This highlighted a terrifying shift toward modern, agile, autonomous drone warfare. You were dealing with a pervasive technology that is cheap, hard to detect, and doesn't respect traditional physical borders.
How do you fight that?
Multiple NATO member states had to scramble and contribute advanced fighter jets, radar networks, and naval anti-air units specifically to counter these incursions. It requires an entirely new doctrine. I mean, how do you efficiently use a $100 million F-35 fighter jet to shoot down a swarm of drones that cost a few $1,000s each?
So the military apparatus is actively adapting, trying to figure out 21st century asymmetric warfare. But while the generals are figuring out the drones, the political foundation holding the generals together is violently shaking.
Shaking to its core.
Our source material outlines a period of completely unprecedented internal political crisis between 2024 and 2026.
It does. The text documents a severe, deeply destabilizing rift between the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump and the vast majority of other NATO member states.
Now, we discussed earlier how NATO has had political friction before. Robert Gates yelling about defense spending in 2011, for example.
Right, but this is different.
What makes this 2024-2026 period so uniquely dangerous is that the friction escalated far beyond arguments over budgets. It involved direct public threats to the actual sovereignty and territorial integrity of founding NATO members by the leader of the alliance's most powerful nation.
Again, just to be clear, we are neutrally reporting the exact events as documented in our 2026 encyclopedic source text. We're looking at the structural impact of these events on the alliance.
Let's look at the specific geopolitical crises the source mentions.
The source cites several alarming diplomatic breakdowns. Most notably, it points to the Greenland crisis and wider severe deteriorations in relations where the U.S. president repeatedly, publicly threatened the sovereignty of Canada and Denmark.
That is wild to think about.
This included the president reiterating highly controversial proposals suggesting the absorption of Canadian territory into the United States.
Let's just pause and absorb that. You have an alliance built entirely, fundamentally, on the sacred premise of mutual defense of each other's territory.
That's the whole point.
And the leader of the most powerful military in that alliance is openly suggesting annexing the territory of its own allies. That is intellectually and strategically dizzying.
But the text says the absolute breaking point, the moment the entire structure wobbled, happens during an active military crisis in March 2026.
The source refers to this as the paper tiger moment.
What happened?
During a period of intense kinetic military conflict, specifically the March 2026 Israeli-United States strikes on Iran, a massive secondary crisis erupted over global shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
So shipping lanes are blocked again.
The U.S. called on its NATO allies to deploy naval assets to help forcefully reopen the strait. When the European allies hesitated or refused the call, President Trump reacted with fury.
Publicly.
He publicly branded the European allies as cowards and posted on social media a statement declaring that without the USA, NATO is a paper tiger.
Okay, I have to ask the foundational existential question here. Can an alliance that is built entirely on absolute, unquestioning trust survive if its foundational members are openly fighting over territory like Greenland or publicly calling each other cowards during an active shooting military crisis?
It's a huge problem.
I mean, we talked about Article 5 being the ultimate shield, but Article 5 is literally just ink on paper if the enemy doesn't believe the people who signed it will actually show up to fight.
You are hitting on the fundamental psychological vulnerability of NATO. An alliance is not made of tanks or fighter jets. It is made of credibility.
Exactly.
We discussed the mechanics of the treaty earlier. Article 4 is the mechanism for emergency consultations when a nation feels threatened. Article 5 is the actual trigger for mutual war.
But both rely on trust.
Both of those legal mechanisms rely completely on the assumption of absolute, unbreakable solidarity. If the primary guarantor of that security, the United States, which contributes the vast majority of the high-end military capability and the nuclear deterrent, if that guarantor publicly doubts, belittles, or actively threatens the alliance, the deterrence factor crumbles instantly. The psychological shield evaporates.
Because, as we established with the Cold War, deterrence only works if the enemy is 100% convinced you will fight. If there is a 10% chance you won't show up, the enemy might take the gamble.
Exactly. Doubt is the enemy of deterrence. Now, to be historically fair, NATO has survived severe internal rifts before.
Oh, definitely.
We mentioned the bitter divides over the Libya mission. Even earlier, during the Cold War in 1966, France, under Charles de Gaulle, actually completely withdrew from NATO's integrated military command structure over fierce policy disputes with the US and UK.
They forced NATO headquarters to move out of Paris.
And France didn't fully reintegrate into the command structure until 2009. So there is historical precedent for massive internal friction.
But the 2026 crisis feels fundamentally different than France withdrawing in the 60s.
It is different. The 2026 crisis is the ultimate stress test of the institution itself. It tests whether the immense, deeply entrenched bureaucratic momentum of NATO, the 3.5 million personnel, the integrated commands like SHAPE, the massive interoperable logistics networks, the standardized ammunition, can survive a fracture at the executive head of state level.
It is a real-time test of whether the institutional machinery of the alliance is stronger than the volatile politics of the moment.
Wow, what an absolutely staggering journey. We have covered nearly a century of geopolitical history today, and the evolution is just breathtaking. Let me do a quick recap for you, the listener, so we can see the whole board and how all these pieces fit together.
It helps to zoom out.
We started in the ruins of 1949 with a quiet, purely defensive Cold War deterrent, a piece of paper signed to keep Soviet tanks out of Western Europe. We saw how the panic of the Korean War forced them to build a massive, integrated military machine.
SHAPE and all of that.
For 40 years, it was a hyper-tense, heavily armed waiting game, where the ultimate success was that not a single shot was ever fired.
Then the wall falls.
Then the Berlin Wall falls, the 90s hit, and the Soviet Union vanishes. NATO faces an existential identity crisis. Rather than disbanding, they pivot.
They become crisis managers.
They transform into a controversial, active crisis manager, firing their first shots in the bloody breakup of Yugoslavia and dropping bombs in Kosovo without UN approval to stop a humanitarian disaster.
An expanding east.
At the same time, they begin pushing their borders eastward, absorbing former Soviet bloc nations, a move celebrated in Warsaw but viewed as a profound betrayal in Moscow.
And then 9/11 changes everything again.
Then comes the shock of 9/11, flipping the script of the alliance and pushing NATO completely out of its traditional geographic area. For 2 decades, they are fighting complex counterinsurgencies in the mountains of Afghanistan and hunting pirates off the Horn of Africa, dealing with immense mission creep and bitter internal fights over burden sharing, culminating in the tragic fall of Kabul in 2021.
And just as the alliance seemed permanently exhausted and bogged down in global policing, the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the massive 2022 invasion of Ukraine violently swung the pendulum back.
The reality of conventional war in Europe forced NATO to return to its original roots.
It was reborn as a heavily fortified European shield against Moscow, expanding to include the historically neutral nations of Finland and Sweden, and forcing member states to finally open their wallets and meet the 2% defense spending targets.
And finally, that brings us to our chaotic current moment in 2026. An alliance trying to adapt its massive conventional militaries to the terrifying new reality of cheap, autonomous drone swarms over Eastern Europe, while simultaneously trying to manage a fractured, deeply volatile political reality where the leader of its most powerful member is questioning its very existence.
It is a lot to take in.
But the next time you see a headline about NATO, whether it's a wonky argument about GDP defense spending targets, a leader threatening to invoke Article 5, or a diplomatic squabble between presidents, you now have the deep structural context to know exactly what is happening beneath the surface and the history driving those decisions.
But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over.
Oh, I like this one.
It's drawn from a very specific, somewhat obscure rule buried in the original 1949 treaty text that we haven't discussed yet, but which has massive implications for the future. Article 6 of the NATO treaty explicitly defines the geographic area of responsibility where an attack triggers mutual defense.
And what does it say?
It legally states that Article 5 only applies to attacks on territories, vessels, and aircraft located north of the Tropic of Cancer.
Wait, hold on. The Tropic of Cancer, like the literal imaginary line of latitude drawn across the globe.
Yes. During the original 1949 treaty negotiations, the drafters specifically wanted to exclude the colonial possessions of European powers in the global south, like the Belgian Congo or French Indochina, from the treaty's protection.
They didn't want to fight colonial wars.
They didn't want NATO getting dragged into colonial independence wars.
Yeah.
So they drew a literal, physical line across a map of the globe. But think about the profound implications of that in our modern era.
Because we aren't just fighting with tanks and ships anymore.
Exactly. We're no longer fighting with just tanks and ships. We are living in an age of globalized, instantly devastating cyber attacks that completely ignore physical borders.
And space assets.
We have vital space-based military assets. Our source even explicitly mentions the U.S. Space Force maintaining the crucial Pacific Space Base up in Greenland. We are dealing with autonomous drone swarms that can be controlled from servers located half a world away.
That is wild to think about. So let's play this out. If a crippling, highly sophisticated state-sponsored cyber attack completely takes down the power grid of the eastern seaboard of the United States, or shuts down the banking sector of London, but intelligence proves the servers launching the attack are physically located in the global south, strictly below the Tropic of Cancer, does that legally trigger Article 5?
That's the billion-dollar question.
What happens if a communication satellite that is absolutely crucial to European missile defense is intentionally disabled or destroyed in orbit, thousands of miles out in space, far beyond any earthly map line?
It raises a profound, unresolved question about the future of warfare. Does the idea of geographically bounding a mutual defense treaty to an imaginary line drawn on a physical map by men in suits in 1949 make any logical sense in a borderless digital spacefaring 2026?
Does the Tropic of Cancer still matter when the primary battlefield has shifted into cyberspace or low Earth orbit?
The treaty was written for a physical world. We now live in a virtual one.
It brings us right back to the exact metaphor we started with today. We all want clean, binary diagnoses. We want to be able to point to a jagged white line on an X-ray or point to a specific line of latitude on a map and say with absolute certainty, there's the problem right there. That is the boundary.
But modern warfare simply doesn't work like that anymore.
The world has outgrown the map. The X-ray machine is fundamentally broken. The waters are muddy, complex, and deeply ironic. And navigating that exact murkiness, understanding the history that brought us to the edge of the map, is the real challenge of the 21st century.
It absolutely is.
Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us on this massive deep dive into the evolution of NATO. Keep questioning the headlines, keep exploring the history, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening.